hold music. You want to avoid it, and so do your customers. So say goodbye to hold music and hello to faster, smarter support with Salesforce. Make service more personal and agents more productive using built-in trusted AI. Then watch costs and wait times drop and satisfaction soar. Support customers in a whole new way with Service GPT. Learn how at salesforce.com/servicegpt.
Welcome to Nature-Backed podcast of Singular. In this series, we are talking with investors about their vision of the new green world. My name is Tarmo Virki, and in this episode 3, I sat down with Natasha Jones from Octopus Ventures to discuss about how her company is seeing the climate tech investment scene developing. Enjoy the show. Natasha, say a few words about, what is Octopus doing?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks so much for having me, Tom, on the show. So Octopus Ventures is a venture capital fund headquartered in London. We specialize in early stage investments and back companies and founders who are really pioneering new and category defining businesses. In terms of where we invest, so it's really sector agnostic, but we've decided to split ourselves into these sector focused teams. So we have a healthcare team that do everything from digital health all the way to biotech. We have a consumer team that will do consumer products all the way to future of work software. We have deep tech, and they do all the kind of cool stuff, I think, like drones and quantum computing. We have a B2B enterprise software team, and I sit in the Fintech team. So we really do quite the spectrum of early stage investments.
And early stage for you guys means what exactly?
That's also a good question because it's a bit of a slippery term nowadays. So really, we'll seek to invest when a kind of MVP product is on the market and the company or the founders are really looking to expand their team and their commercial presence. And that's when we'll come in and really throw fuel onto the fire, help with kind of those fast key hires and professionalizing the senior management team, as well as, we've got a really great talent team here at Octopus as well that are really hands-on. And then obviously everything to do with sales as well. So yeah, really when it's like fast green shoots of a great product, that's when we tend to get really excited.
When this show is called Nature-Backed podcast, when nature-backed investing or nature-backed finance is mentioned, what comes to your mind?
It's really interesting because I think a lot of this discussion will be about climate topics, but actually for me, nature-backed isn't necessarily in the umbrella of climate tech. It's quite specific actually, and I'm seeing more and more technology catered specifically to things like nature regeneration, reforestation, adaptation of natural climates, and the whole spectrum of technologies that can help enable that, from drones, automating, replanting trees, which I've seen, which is absolutely incredible, all the way to satellite imagery, data processing, in order to assess where the best reforestation projects should go. So for me, like nature-backed investing is actually very similar to nature-based investing, but caters more to the various tools and data providers and services that are required to make that more efficient.
In the you said you're sitting in the fintech team, but what kind of green investments have you guys made, or have you personally been involved in?
Yeah, so I think I sit in the fintech team, and for me, climate fintech is really important. Now, what do I mean by climate fintech? It's really how can we use data and transactions and use that as a nexus of essentially human activity to bring us to a low carbon world. So thinking about how, if we can footprint people's activities and businesses' activities as precisely as possible, that becomes a really valuable data source to nudge behaviors in the right ways and align incentives, financial incentives with environmental advantages. And that first investment into that space that we made was called Minimum. and they do carbon accounting. So they trained their carbon accounting models on consumer data, and that's enabled them to build a really powerful algorithm to measure business emissions, actually. And so that's what they're doing, and they're helping businesses go carbon neutral. So not only, and for me this is really key, not only assessing your carbon footprint and providing a number on that, but telling you where the biggest areas are for improvement, because I think decarbonizing is key. You don't need to just, it's great to know, but it's also better to know how to kind of move the needle on your emissions. And then finally, the final step, decarbonizing and offsetting, of course. So offsetting what you can't decarbonize at this stage. So that was our first investment in climate fintech. And we're looking pretty closely at the kind of whole suite. There's one which we can't quite announce just yet, but thinking about where those data providers can come, for example, so specialist data providers, I think will become really important in future. I'm also looking very closely at green financial products. So again, how to use different data sources and bake those in to new financial products, thinking about green mortgages, for example, or green investment products. And then I think it's also important to note that Octopus invests also across all of its teams will have climate investments. So the consumer team do a lot in the circular economy, such as Depop, which is one of our unicorn exits, as well as Wally, which is helping kids become more environmental by having this kind of circular toy subscription model. So lots and lots to be getting on with.
I think the links to the startups we'll add to the show notes, but the green financial products was the thing which really kind of tickled my mind. I mean, do you see some kind of a wave of green financial products? And if the big banks come out with a green financial products, my suspicious mind always says that this must be greenwashing. I mean, what on earth are they doing?
Yeah, there's such a distrust of big banks providing green financial products.
Obviously.
The data is really clear, though. So if you can move your pension to a green and sustainable pension, it's 27 times more effective than going vegan, which, as someone who tried to go vegan and failed, I can tell you it seems a lot easier to just select a green pension provider. In terms of, I think what's super interesting is now the regulatory push to clamp down on greenwashing. And that's tied to consumer distrust as well. So I think in France, there was a survey, 60% of consumers distrust green labeling from banks. I think for our space, that's created kind of an opportunity. So you're seeing a lot of green fintech saying, well, we know that the big banks, no one trusts them. So we're kind of building a brand from scratch that consumers can trust. And baked into that is a huge amount of transparency. So being very open about what you're investing in and how you're assessing whether something is green or not. So I did a lot of ESG work in my old job. I used to work at a bank, and there's so many different investment strategies for ESG that, of course, the term is very, very slippery. It's everything from we're excluding weapons and tobacco to we're only investing in a renewable energy company. And within that, there's a whole swathe of different ways you can slice the baby, essentially. So I think consumers are right to distrust banks, but perhaps within that, there needs to be greater clarity around ESG, and I think that's what the taxonomy, for example, was really striving to do.
And for the listeners who are not very familiar with the vocabulary, ESG stands for environment,
social governance.
Governance, exactly.
Yeah. So it's a way of assessing. So I think when people talk about ESG, they often think it's associated to environment, because that's the way that banks present it. They say, oh, well, try this new ESG green portfolio, when in fact, ESG doesn't necessarily mean green. There are environmental considerations, but there are also social considerations such as whether you're paying workers a fair wage will be baked into those calculations, and G, governance will take into account accounting transparency, for example. So it's I think there's over 50 metrics that it could incorporate, if not, and within that, there'll be different data sets as well that can be used. So it's very much a slippery world.
I read one of your blog posts about this, and remember, probably will always remember that the amount of ESG investing has grown massively, but the challenge is that who defines ESG exactly how, and what's included and what's not included. And probably from the big banks' view, it's always better to include as much as possible, because then their portfolio looks much more, kind of new generation friendly.
Yeah, I think, if I'm honest, I think as much as a lot of it's driven by consumer demand for new, sustainable, both people and planet, sustainable investing products, I've got to say that I think there is a lot of will within banks to change and to provide these new portfolios, green portfolios. I think the tooling isn't quite there. For example, the data's not there. Lots of companies still don't report on many of the factors that are really important for these calculations, and that provides difficulty. There's also a difficulty around exclusion. That's really getting into the weeds, but thinking, okay, well, do we exclude all oil, fossil fuel producers? When that excludes actually from the S&P 500, that would exclude most energy companies. So there's a bit of a challenge around exclusion of whole sectors, because that leaves you really exposed. But I think generally, as I said, I think this is really where green fintech becomes super exciting, because consumers can see that this digital platform provides transparency. It provides real-time performance data on your assets, real-time performance data on the environmental metrics going into it. And so I think I'm seeing some really exciting things happening in that space. And I think consumers are actually really snatching these products out of the hands of these green fintechs, because, I know everyone wants to do better. They're not really sure how. And these provide quite an easy, low-hanging fruit way of doing it.
And the kind of the data collection opportunity, of course, is something which is very, very natural for probably many startup founders and many startups, because, they've been doing this or something like this across the sectors. It's just, about the time this was coming to the financial industry.
Yeah, I think the data collection piece, correct me if I'm wrong, but the data collection piece still feels like the hardest piece actually in this to solve. As I said, a lot of companies don't report or report with unclear methodology, and that makes it hard to calculate, to create green financial products. I think even in terms of carbon accounting, a can of chickpeas from the UK for a particular farm will have a very different carbon footprint from a can of chickpeas in France, for example, for so many different reasons. I mean, just the complexities involved in the creation of one clean, understandable number is very, very difficult. And there's two separate ways of doing this data gathering piece. There's estimation-based data collection, so saying, people taking a top-down approach, this sector tends to produce X amount. It's all about plugging in the gaps using existing data sets. And then there's another approach of getting incredibly granular and tracing step-by-step a carbon emission supply chain as such. And that creates a huge amount of manual work usually, and that's where consultancies have tended to lie. And so I think, again, where tech can play a really essential role is automating a lot of these processes to try and get closer and closer to accuracy, because without accuracy, you can't create objective and reliable, even decarbonization targets, because you actually perhaps might be doing more harm than good in some ways. So I think it's just really complicated. But I think the accuracy piece I've seen some really great stuff in things in obviously with machine learning, but with satellites, and also just fundamentally just engaging with stakeholders. And I think that's what environmental kind of fintechs or environmental data startups have really tried to crack, is trying to actually get all these different nodes in a supply chain to talk to each other through automation, but also through intelligent UI design. So that's also quite interesting.
How much do you see there's a challenge of, how would I say, a timeline challenge? I mean, I can see that there is importance of getting these details of the CO2 emission calculations right, but it could probably take decades before all this information is together. At the same time, we are seeing, looking out of the window there, in the middle of winter, it's +5 in Estonia. It used to be -20 a week ago. The climate is changing around us, and it feels often that we're kind of late doing the math or the working on Excel.
Yeah, the timing point is really interesting. I think a few thoughts on that. When I first started in finance, people weren't taking ESG seriously. There was demand from certain quite avant-garde clients, but nowhere near the level of demand we're seeing now. And I think there's been a noticeable shift in interest for ESG, but also for climate tech more generally. And actually, for a huge amount of interest, huge amount of more interest is going into things that previously were seen as quite uninvestable, such as hardware. And I think that is testament to the fact that there's this renewed sense of urgency. I think other things that are really key is that, by 2030, a number of corporates, 45% of the FTSE 100, have made some form of net zero target. A lot of those will be in 2030. And I don't expect, in 2029, I hope that there isn't this huge demand for offsets in 2029 as these companies realize that they're nowhere near close to hitting targets. I think there's a lot of work and strategic work being put in place now to make those targets a reality. So I think things are changing. I think as an investor, we are looking a lot at the carbon accounting. We're looking a lot at things like offsetting, which are now previously had been, I think, disregarded as these forms of like paper indulgences to make yourself feel better, but now are seen as really important to getting us to net zero. But I think, I think attitudes are definitely changing towards those sorts of offerings, and I think that's going to continue. So there's a lot of, from my perspective, I think there's a lot of optimism in terms of timing, but also forward-looking investments in terms of risk. And that's another thing that I look at in the fintech space is climate risk. So how we can model kind of climate events more and more precisely, because they are happening, as you said, and things are changing. And I think have probably passed the point where things aren't going to change. And so again, for, things like just supply chain risk or, insurance needs to start taking these things into account.
I think as it really has an impact on insurance, I think in general, the global insurance industry has probably been one of the early ones to at least acknowledge the risks and do the math on the background. How does it impact the economies? I've been reading lately the kind of GDP impact studies from the biggest reinsurers, and they look rather bleak.
Totally agree. I think I'm always really interested to hear of how people first get into climate tech, or just in general start to have an interest in climate change. And usually it is by starting to read a report and just realizing the magnitude and the scale of some of these effects. For me, that penny really dropped a few years ago when I just read an IPCC report and I was like, oh my God, if this is if this is the statistical average of all these scientists, you're going to be seeing a lot of evidence that's going to be even more extreme than what's in that paper. So, what's in that paper is pretty alarming. So, it's pretty shocking. And I think as a result, we are seeing a lot of insurers reach out to us as investors and say, we need new tools, new solutions, new models, new data sets, because the way of calculating insurance premiums is actually not suited to climate change, because the risks aren't static, they're dynamic for climate-related risks, and they're non-linear, right? So, a flood which breaks a bridge, that's suddenly a $1 billion loss. It's not a gradual thing that can be tracked as kind of time series data. So, yeah.
With this urgency and with the kind of amount of companies popping up in the sector, in early December, I also followed the NOAA conference in Zurich. There's so much going on in this sector. I mean, how would you describe the kind of current, climate of the climate tech world?
I think the first thing to note, and I don't know if you felt this at the NOAA conference, but just a huge amount of collaboration. I think other sectors tend to be a bit more cagey on sharing IP, on collaborating between different stakeholders, from entrepreneurs all the way to policymakers and investors in between. Climate tech is really different in that sense. Everyone's very keen to collaborate to find different solutions, and I think that's what makes it a really optimistic space to be in, actually. I think the other point to note is, as I said, the people are starting to think much more holistically about what climate tech can mean. So for us to really hit these net zero targets by 2050, we're not just going to need one sector to decarbonize, we're going to need a whole ecosystem of change. So I think some funds and even some founders have taken an approach of saying, well, we're not climate focused, but I still want to be best in class for climate. And that's really been a step change, I think, thinking about, if, for example, we have a large focus on climate change and climate tech, partly because the other half of our business used to be Octopus Energy, which is the UK's biggest renewable energy provider, for people who might not be into the UK energy landscape. But, the consumer team, they're not specialized in climate change, but circular business models are starting to make a lot of business sense now and have a lot of traction from climate conscious users. So climate tech, or best in class kind of sustainability, is also seen as good business. And I think that's massively changed. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you are seeing an increasing amount of climate specialist funds that are being started up to support really deep tech innovation in climate tech. And that's everywhere. That's everywhere from hardware all the way to satellites. And that, again, really veers off the typical VC model of favoring software, and being prepared to deploy very, very patient capital into quite high risk technology. And I think, again, that's due to this sense of urgency. I'd say there's the kind of two notable shifts.
I mean, that's the kind of the big picture thinking, and the big picture, also the positive side of the big picture. But what about the kind of on the ground thinking that, when you're, competing for the investment deal into a company, is there just, sometimes too much interest from the investors and not enough projects, or is it vice versa?
I think there will never be enough projects tackling this problem. There are infinite number of approaches to climate change. And I think if I was a climate tech founder, it's important not to be wary of competition, because the more players you have in your space, in a way, it starts to validate that category. So I think from my perspective, the more projects, the better. And I also think founders being selective about what investors they get, they're definitely starting to see more attention. And again, I think that's a good thing because investors should be scrutinized on their climate credentials and their knowledge on the space. So, definitely more competitive, but I think it's a good thing.
Thanks, Natasha. We'll wrap it up here for this show and join us again for the next episode. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. We will be back next week. Turn on to Nature-backed podcast.
If you want to hear all the newest hits in today's hip-hop and R&B...
21, can you do something for me? 21. Can you hit a little rich flex for me?
And I'm bad like the Barbie. I'm a doll, but I still wanna party. Pink felt like I'm ready to bend. I'm a 10, so I pull in a can. Like,
what up, it's your boy Lil Durk. All my life, they be trying to keep me down.
Make sure to check out Urban 95, your #1 urban party station, by downloading the free Audless app, available now on both the Google Play and App Store.
Electricast. Welcome to the Candle Power Hour. Come with us backstage behind the scenes of show business spanning over 4 decades and bringing you the experiences that can only be told by the people who were there.
Our guests are from the A-list, the F-list, and everyone in between. Get set for some of the most insane, hilarious, and inspiring stories you will ever hear.
I'm Mercury.
And I'm Diego.
Your hosts for the Candle Power Hour.
Electricast.